Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. It is Wednesday, June 24th, in the middle of a summer of the most consequential issues happening in our country, from the pandemic to our issue of racial justice that we're dealing with, to the upcoming elections in November that I think many people feel are very, very crucial to our future as a country. And we also cannot forget, we have to remember, this is the summer we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. And so we've been doing a series of programs to highlight that. Too bad we can't go out personally to the many museums all around the country that are commemorating this important event, but we're trying to make up for it by educating ourselves here and talking to as many people as we can. So today we have two very special women who in their own right are actors, playwrights, people in the community doing important public service things and advocacy, as well as their performance and playwriting skills. So let me introduce Emma Palzia-Ray, who is going to tell us about one of the people in the suffragette movement. And then we have Lisa Hayes, who is also going to help us to learn about another one. Hi, nice to see you both today.
Hi, for having us.
So Emma, give us a little bit of a background about you, a little bit about your education and all of the things you're involved in. And I know the work that you do now at Artreach. We've had you on the show for that. Just give us a little summary.
Yeah, so it's great to be back here to talk more specifically about suffrage and Victoria Woodhull. I attended Emerson College in Boston, majoring in acting and minoring in creative writing and speech. Shortly afterwards, I moved to New York, where I pursued my acting career. And along the way, I started to produce one-woman shows because I'm just like need to work all the time, and there wasn't enough work for women. And kind of out of passion for gender equity, as well as for telling important stories that we're not hearing on the stage, women's stories. I really enjoyed my experiences that came about as performing solo theater plays. Out of that, I created a festival in New York called Womenkind, which we presented every March for over 10 years in Lower Manhattan to celebrate Women's History Month. And it was a festival of one-woman shows, not all historical portrayals. That was, could be any genre, any type of play. It was important that it was one woman performing on stage. So a director or playwright could be male who maybe brought the show to the festival, but it was really about giving women performing opportunities and creating a model to enable people to produce and present their shows in New York City. And that's how I first met Lisa, who's joining me here today. And as my career progressed, I also became a arts nonprofit manager in arts organizations, which brought me up to this area when I was executive director of the Chorus of Westerly in the early 2000s. And I continue my work in advocacy, theater, and the arts today, working at Artreach. So did I cover it all, or do you want me to talk about Woodhull yet?
Well, no, not yet, because you didn't cover another area where you and I came together, and more particularly, Safe Futures, where you worked and advocated as a director of development and advocacy on domestic violence issues, right? You did that for several years, and that's an important. Okay, I think you covered a lot of it. I'm sure there's so much more, but we'll get into it. And now, Lisa, give us your summary of all of your accomplishments.
Okay. So my name is Lisa Hayes. I grew up in Montana and Wyoming, and actually got my drama degree at the University of Washington. And then I studied in London at the Joan White English Theatre School. All of this combined and led me to eventually to the East Coast. And I started out my professional life working as an arts administrator at an arts foundation in Baltimore. And then I realized the acting bug wasn't going away. So I moved to New York to pursue my career. And I, too, like Emma, got frustrated that there was no work for women. So I created a one-woman show of Jane Eyre, which I've toured across the country and done a tour in England and Scotland at castles and stately homes. I did it in Prague. Then my husband and I moved to Buffalo. He got a job there and we were ready to leave New York. And I went back to school and got a PhD in American Studies. And I found it was the perfect way for me to combine my interest in history and women's stories with scholarly work. And while I was there, I created another one-woman show about a nurses' strike based on a real strike that was happening on Long Island. I've done that solo show in Turkey and Rome and a variety of places across the country. My PhD in American Studies then led me to the world of public history and museums. I spent 10 years at the Accokeek Foundation, which stewards 200 acres of Piscataway Park, which is a national park on the Potomac River. And we had a living history farm there and interpreted a colonial family before the Revolution. We had a livestock program. It was an amazing experience, and I rose to be the CEO and president for over 6 years. During that time, I also wrote a musical about breast cancer, which was produced. I created another one-woman show based on Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Marissa Roth and her journey in documenting women in war, which I had the opportunity to perform in The Hague. Then when I left the Accokeek Foundation a couple of years ago, I wanted to reconnect to my theater roots. And I decided to write a play about suffrage, which is how I came to be here today to talk about the show I created.
Okay, great. So you've given us a good history, both of you, on your backgrounds. And now we want to get into those two women on the road to the 19th Amendment. It's interesting that if you ask people what their knowledge is about the suffragette movement, most of them would mention Susan B. Anthony, and maybe some would remember Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Both of those are probably remembered as prominent leaders. However, at least Lisa has someone, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was very important toward the end of the march toward the 19th Amendment in 1920 and very instrumental in the creation of the League of Women Voters, which we have today. So Carrie Chapman Catt, someone we really need to know more about, and I bet most people do not know about her. And now we're going to start with Emma, who also has someone on the road to the 19th Amendment, who was a little bit more offbeat, who you probably wouldn't know, but she has something that's so unbelievable that she did during her time in the 1800s that we're going to talk about. So Emma, you start. Why did you pick Victoria Woodhull as your subject when you decided to write a play and impersonate her in her life?
So it came about, and it's been a long time in the making. It came about because I was researching Harriet Beecher Stowe, who I have been performing for almost 20 years. And Woodhull kept coming up in archives and books I was reading. And then around that same time, a biography came out about Victoria Woodhull. And it was big news around Hartford and the Stowe Center because the book had been heavily researched at Harriet Beecher Stowe's house in Hartford. The connection being that Victoria Woodhull is the reason that Henry Ward Beecher went on trial for adultery. And she was very close friends with Harriet and Henry's sister, Isabella Beecher Hooker, who was very involved in the suffrage movement and, alongside of Susan B. Anthony. They were quite close as well. So there was this circle of people. that were kind of connected. However, Victoria was really on the fringe of that. And as I read about her and was so fascinated, I also was a little angry. Like, why didn't I know that a woman had run for president of the United States in 1872? How come we?
Oh, you gave it away. You gave it away so early. That's okay. Go ahead.
So that got me really curious and wanting to look more into her story, but I struggled with how to tell it. And every 4 years when it would be an election year coming, I would say to myself, well, I've really got to get this play going, for a presidential election year. And it really took 12 to 16 years for me to really wrap my mind around how to tell the story. And I did my first workshop performances of it 4 years ago that happened to coincide with the Democratic National Convention at which Hillary got elected. And it's been a very interesting play to perform during this time because our perspectives are constantly changing. But what makes her even more interesting is running for president wasn't the only first that she accomplished. She was the first woman to open a stock brokerage firm on Wall Street. She was the first woman to publish her own newspaper. She was the first woman who ever addressed Congress in the United States, where she spoke about making a case for why women had already inherently the right to vote. And she, of course, was the first woman to run for president in the United States. And she was also the first person arrested under the Comstock law, which circles back to that adultery trial. And then in my play, I also divulged that she was the first woman to drive from England to France and back again. And she probably had the most speeding tickets for anybody in the 1920s in the UK as well. But the speed limit was 20 miles per hour. So.
Well, that's great. We're going to get back to her and get into a little more depth. But now let's go to Lisa. So we know why Emma chose Victoria Woodhull. Very compelling reasons. It's unbelievable that more people don't know about her. But again, that may be a function of the fact that women's history is not as well documented and known as men's is in America. And we still haven't had a woman president in this country. Shame on us. So Lisa, tell us how you came to discover Carrie Chapman Catt as a subject for one of your shows. And I would point out that one of the things that we're dealing with today is the idea that so many of the statues and that commemorate the history of the Confederacy and the Civil War, so many of them in the South especially, and even places in the North that commemorate things when the values that we had were not in keeping with American values. They're now in great controversy, tearing down statues. And isn't that a way that you've somehow got involved with the Carrie Chapman Catt issue? Talk about that.
Okay. Well, I had decided I wanted to do a suffrage play and read the newly published book called The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss, which is a page turner. It's amazing. It's about that last battle in Tennessee. And that's how I came to know about Carrie Chapman Catt. I thought, like Emma said about Victoria Woodhull, I was like, why haven't I ever heard of this woman? She was once one of the most famous women in the world. She created the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, the League of Women Voters. How is it I didn't know about her? So then I dug in, and like Emma, I was trying to find a way to tell the story, and I wanted to incorporate the fact that there is all this controversy now around how African-American women were marginalized in the suffrage movement. So I decided to frame the play with an actress coming in she's been booked to perform her show of Carrie Cat. And there have been for the dedication of a statue of Carrie Cat. And with all these protests and Twitter storm, there's a chance the performance is going to be canceled and the statue is going to be torn down. So she meets with the leaders of the protests and said, I thought if you saw a rehearsal of my show and got to know Mrs. Cat, you might change your mind. And that idea for a statue being pulled down was actually based on a thing I discovered that happened in the mid-1990s, where the alma mater of Carrie Chapman Catt, Iowa State, students were protesting and calling Carrie Cat a white supremacist and a racist, and they wanted to rename the residence hall, which was called Cat Hall, to get rid of her name. And now I've discovered just this week, there's still the protests have come back. And I wanted to address in my play that that when you criticize something in history and make a blanket judgment of someone's position and something they said, you really need to have a better understanding of the context in which it was said. So I probably babbled on there about how.
No, I think we should just continue to touch on it a bit, because I think it's important for us to realize in the study of American history leading to 1920 and women getting the right to vote, because we know it took them like 72 years from 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, till 1920. And there was a lot of marching, a lot of turmoil, and a lot of bloodshed, and a lot of controversy in between. A lot of women went to jail, went on hunger strikes for that. We should be aware of that. But we should also be aware of the fact that when the Civil War was over and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, which gave rights to Black Americans and gave Blacks the right to vote, Black women were not given the right to vote. And many American women in the suffragette movement thought that after the Civil War, when voting rights were open to Blacks, they would be open to women as well. And they were not. So Lisa, in that context, tell us a little about that controversy.
Okay, I'm hopefully not frozen again. So during that last battle to get the amendment ratified, one of the strategies that the white leaders like Carrie Cat used in promoting ratification of the amendment was Carrie Cat said, there are more white women than Negro women. And one could say that suffrage would strengthen the case of white supremacy, not weaken it. That's what's been held up. But that was part of a whole strategy to make sure that the Southern states came on board to ratify the amendment, because without at least some Southern states, it wouldn't have happened.
Yes, go ahead, Lisa. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think I finished that thought. I mean, my play includes Carrie Cat. Well, at the end, after I have finished being Carrie Cat and return as the actress, I make the case that instead of tearing down a statue of Carrie Chapman Catt, why don't we put up one of Mary Church Terrell, another amazing American woman that no one's ever heard of, who was the founder and leader of the National Association of Colored Women. She gave the welcoming speech at an international conference in Europe. She was the one to give that speech Carrie Cat was a friend of hers and watched this. She saw Mary Church Terrell give the opening remarks, not just in English, but in fluent French and German. We can't throw away the women that have contributed to our history. We have to know about it. And I learned in my research that of the 5,500 publicly accessible outdoor statues in America, 200 are of women. That's 5,300 men and 200 women. So we need more statues of these amazing women who have contributed to our history.
Interesting. That's terrific. So let's get back to Victoria Woodhull. Emma, what was it in her background that made her have this inspiration to do the things that she did, to run for president, to speak to Congress, to give us a little bit about her background that led her to these momentous things?
Well, and it's not what you're going to expect. I'll just give you that forewarning. And it's interesting that both Lisa and I have chosen to set our plays today. My play is also set today, where Victoria appears to us and puts her own context on her life as somebody who was way ahead of her time. But Victoria Woodhull was born in very rural Ohio to an extremely dysfunctional family. Her father drank and gambled, but he had these two daughters, Victoria and Tennessee, who were not only beautiful, they were clairvoyant. And so they were paraded around to medicine shows, and their services sold as clairvoyants. And, you could speculate on what else might have been sold, although there's no proof in that. She was taught to read by a neighbor. And so, not from an educated or privileged background by any stretch of the imagination. But around the time of 8, she started having visions and had just a very strong conviction that she had a mission and purpose in life. And that really drove her throughout, throughout the 1800s and throughout her life, that she had a higher calling. And that all the trials and tribulations that she had been put through all gave her purpose. She herself was ill when she was 14, and the doctor who came to tend to her proposed to her. He was much older than her, also an alcoholic, and she bore a child in that marriage who was born with intellectual disability. Again, this really fueled her perspective on the world and the plight of women. This is where her thoughts on marriage and love and the impact that had on children and the situations in which children were created, and whether or not the children were healthy or had opportunity. All these kind of came out of her own life experience. So when she had an opportunity and her spirit guides told her to flee and where to go, she ran away from Dr. Woodhull and made her own living giving readings and advice for money for people. So she would set up shop and, a little, palm reader studio. She didn't read palms, but, psychic reading studios. And as she traveled around, that's what she observed, that women were oppressed and suffering at the hands of men. Often within their marriages, they were suffering. And this really fueled her. She met her real life partner, James Harvey Blood, because he came in for a spiritual reading, and they were together from that day forward. And he too was an educator and mentor for her, and they just explored the ideas, political ideas, and social theories that were coming out at the time. Stephen Pearl Andrews, Karl Marx, and really developed their own perspective on things. So she was not part of any civic groups. She was not part of any societal movement. She was really purely on her own, learning and coming up with her ideas and educating herself around issues and forming her own ideas. And then when her spirit guides told her to go to New York, they gave her the exact address where she should go and look for a house, 17 Great Jones Street. And she went there, moved her whole family with her, and they lived there and started hobnobbing with people in New York. She met Cornelius Vanderbilt, who took quite a liking to her sister Tennessee. And they said to the Commodore, they said, well, we'll advise you on when to buy and sell stocks. At which he said, okay, if you are that clairvoyant and I do well in the stock market because of you, I'll give you 10%. And that is the money that they used to open a stock brokerage firm on Wall Street. And their goal was to give women financial security, even though there were very few women to go to them. So, and she did all this just teaching herself, and of course, everything she did was extremely controversial, caused a lot of notoriety. The papers in, there were editorial cartoons that just were so negative about her. But the real deal is they knew how to buy and sell stocks. Now, whether they learned from Vanderbilt or from whoever, they knew what they were doing. And from there, they went and took their own, investments that they earned. And then their next project was to open a newspaper to give voice to women and bring these issues to the forefront and put some of their ideas out there. And all along, they kept hobnobbing with New Yorkers, with people in high places, politicians and whatnot. And soon Victoria was invited to speak to Congress, in which she made a case for women already having the right to vote. That was 1870. It just so happened that Susan B. Anthony and Isabella Beecher Hooker were in the gallery. There was a suffrage meeting taking place, or their convention was going to be coming up in Washington. And so they were in the audience and thought to themselves, how come we never met this woman? Let's have her come speak at our convention next week. So she did. And that's really what started to propel her to the forefront. She was already president of the National Spiritualist Association. So she was in a somewhat of, and this is, post-Civil War, when spiritualism was in its heyday. So she was gaining a lot of experience as a leader, as a public speaker, and rallying people alongside her. But they also very cleverly used their newspaper platform to then create, a lecture tour circuit, so a lot of the things they would write about in their newspaper, she would go on a lecture tour, give speeches, get more people subscribing to the paper, and really was quite ingenious as how they built their following. And then a group of people pulled themselves together. That was a group consisting of women's rights people, Democrats, Republicans, that created an equal rights party. And they did that and asked Victoria to be their nominee for the presidential election in 1872, to which she accepted and felt, well, this was part of her mission. This was her calling, that it had all been leading up to that. Meanwhile, she was still advocating for women's rights. She was an advocate for free love. She pronounced herself as a free lover. But you have to understand, so we look at that and go, well, that's pretty scandalous. She didn't believe in marriage. Yet she had, in the course of her lifetime, 3 very committed relationships. So it wasn't about promiscuity, but it was about creating a loving home. And that marriage was an invention of man to regulate people. But meanwhile, women could not regulate themselves. one of a very powerful line, I think, from her speech on free love is that thousands of rapes are committed every night under the accursed marriage license. And yet she made the case that prostitutes, whom these marriage laws are also aiming to regulate, are free compared to the poor wife, because a prostitute has the power to say no, and a wife does not.
Well, you've really given us a good history. So a couple of things come to mind. One, very interesting, that when she spoke in front of Congress, she was advocating for the position that, in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, all men are created equal. That has to include, they included by definition women. We have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness also. The Constitution could not have left us out. It didn't mean that. Maybe it did back then. So that was a very interesting interpretation of the Constitution. And I think she was right, but didn't work that way. And the other point was that you said that the cartoonists of the day, the newspapers, kind of mocked her in some way. Perhaps it was the spiritualism part that they thought was a little bit too offbeat. So I would gather that during her time, although she was well known, she didn't have the level of seriousness and respect that someone like a Carrie Chapman Catt would have, or Susan B. Anthony, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or some of the other women who perhaps were taken more seriously. Am I right about that? Is that about the way it was?
Yeah, and it had to do with not only her being a spiritualist and running on a platform of free love and speaking quite openly about subjects that were not polite. And she came out of nowhere. She wasn't part of any family. She didn't grow up schooled and educated and with any advantages at all. So she just knew how to meet the right people and connect and become the voice of those people. And it was really this driving mission that propelled her. But, we'd think some of these things were scandalous today. And in fact, many of her speeches, you read them today and you go, whoa, well, we really haven't solved that problem yet.
Yeah. So what about,
it might be different, and within context of the 1870s to 90s, we would think differently. But she herself even, and this is what's curious to me is, she herself later in her life tried to rewrite her story a little bit. Back in the 1800s, people wrote their own biographies or had somebody write them and said, no, I don't want it to sound this way. Right. So, so really digging and finding out the true picture. Early biographies of her are scathing. The cartoons put her in devil horns and things like that in the newspapers at the time. And people just wanted to get rid of her. And sometimes that happens because somebody's really hitting a nerve. I think the other interesting thing to point out is that when she ran for president in 1872, she wasn't even old enough to legally be president until the following year.
The point is, it was so not significant enough an issue that nobody probably challenged her. And I guess my last question before we get to Lisa and our slideshow that we have, my last question is, how many states was she on the ballot for president, and how many votes did she win? Do you have that information?
They did not keep a record of how many votes she got.
Okay.
And interestingly, that is the same election that Susan B. Anthony was arrested for trying to vote. I don't think Susan B. Anthony was voting for Victoria Woodhull. However, she might have been voting for Frederick Douglass, but she too felt Victoria was a little too radical to represent the women's rights movement.
Now, did Frederick Douglass do any campaigning with her? He was her, quote, running mate.
He was, the Equal Rights Amendment kind of came up with this great ticket. I don't believe she even met him until after the election. She herself was in jail on election day because of this Comstock law thing. So, there was a lot kind of going on, and they created this dream ticket, but the process behind it may not have.
Right.
I'm sure
I did ask.
They sent her a letter, and I'm not sure how behind he was.
Yeah. But I did ask if you knew how many ballots she was on, how many states her name was actually on. Sometimes people run for president, they don't make it on all 50 ballots, all 50 states.
Yeah, I believe she was on the ballot everywhere. The Equal Rights Party, did things the right way and followed the. But they were a small new party.
Yeah.
But they had a lot of people behind them. But no record was kept of the number of votes. It was a landslide for the winner, and I think they just said, "Well, we don't have to tally all of this." So,
okay, all right. So Carrie Chapman Catt, Lisa, would she have welcomed Victoria Woodhull into her organization, into her thinking as a fellow traveler along the road to the 19th Amendment?
That is a good question. I need to do some searching to see if they might have ever met. Carrie Catt was born in 1859 in Wisconsin, but was raised in Iowa. She was the only woman in the graduating class of 1880 of the Iowa Agricultural College, which is what the school was called at that time. And she worked as a teacher, a superintendent of schools. She married a guy named Leo Chapman, and they ran a newspaper in Iowa together for a short time before there was some kind of a controversy and they had to sell the paper. He went to California, and then she got a wire that he had typhoid, and she got on a train to go see him, and he died before she got there. So there she was, stuck in San Francisco with no money. She was able to live with an aunt and worked as a journalist a little bit. Not very long after, she ended up meeting and marrying a guy that she knew from Iowa. That was George Catt. He was a successful engineer, which is how she came to be able to follow her passion of organizing and working for the suffrage movement. And he used to say that he was as much a reformer as she was, but that he couldn't work at reforming and earning a living, but he could earn a living for two, so she could reform for two. And they'd been married maybe a couple of months before she was off to her first big campaign with Susan Anthony.
Yeah, interesting. And so what propelled her to really be a leader toward the end of the suffrage movement, in those last few years when they were trying to get President Wilson in the 1918-19 to support them and to make sure that the amendment passed and so forth? What propelled her to all of those leadership positions toward the end? She was there when the success finally came.
She became the head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1900. She was Susan Anthony's successor. So she continued being active in the movement, but she soon switched her focus to the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, which she founded. And then she got she was living in New York, so she was active in the campaign to get an amendment to the state constitution in New York. But then at the end of 1915, the executive committee of the national organization came and asked her to come back as president. And she said, no, I'm too busy and we need younger leaders. But they insisted that they needed her. And so she spent 6 months traveling the country to all these suffrage meetings and conventions. And she said she saw problems everywhere. We're like a camel with 100 humps, each with a blindfolded driver who thought she set the way. We need a purposeful caravan of camels, each with one driver and each driver knowing where she is going. So the first thing they did was try to get a suffrage plank in the 1916 presidential election for both parties, which they succeeded in doing, but both parties weakened the language, putting in states' rights riders, and she got frustrated. She thought they were trying to hoodwink the women, so she called an emergency convention in Atlantic City. The members all came to Atlantic City, and that's where the winning plan was unveiled. And her winning plan, which is what she called it, was, we'll pursue suffrage by the federal route, suffrage by the state route, suffrage east and suffrage west until our dear lawmakers surrender. So that's when they began this last big push. But then the spring of 1917, America entered the war, but they kept pressing on, and she got her members to mobilize to support the war effort, because even though she was completely against war, all war, she saw the bigger picture. And it ended up that the women's support of the war effort helped gain important public and political support for suffrage. So it got her kicked out of the Women's Peace Party, but she stood by her decision. And then, there's this faction of the party that's broken off, the National Women's Party, the young upstart Alice Paul, who's using the tactics that they used in Britain of pickets and protests. And I make the comment in my play, it's a little bit like Nancy Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this old guard and young upstart. So there was that competition, but everybody was pushing for suffrage. So that led into 1918, which is when the amendment first passed the House, but then the Senate wouldn't pass it. So they had to start all over again in 1919, and then it passed the House again, and then it passed the Senate on June 4th, 1919. And then it was, okay, now we need to get it ratified. So that then led them through the whole big push at the end, which finished in Nashville, Tennessee.
Now we're going to get to that story.
Yeah.
Lisa,
Good.
That's a great story in Nashville, Tennessee. I know in some of my readings that Connecticut could have been the final state to ratify the 19th Amendment and put it over the top, but the governor in Connecticut didn't allow it to get put on the agenda or call the legislature. And so that was left to Tennessee. We'll get to that story. But you bring up some other very important points in the history, that the movement was fractured for a time, and that there were people like Alice Paul, who also should be more remembered in history, who was more of the rabble-rouser, who wanted to do the protests, who got the people into jail and really put a magnifying glass on what was happening and wanted to be out in the open more, versus Carrie Chapman Catt, who wanted to do it more by the book, by procedure, through the lobbying of the Congress and the Senate and the House and the states. And then there was the controversy that some people said, let's just get each state to pass an amendment statewide. And we will go through this later in our slides, Lisa. You'll show us that many states, some of the states at that point in the 1917, 18, 19, had already made voting for women part of their constitution. So it's very interesting how it all unfolded. Let's look at our slideshow now, Emma and Lisa, and try to work through some of the interesting points here that you've talked about today. We have okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Emma, okay, well, you get started. This is describe the Woodhull Project. Why don't you just talk about that?
Yeah, so the tagline is, it's not about what she's wearing. And purposefully, I am in a Victorian costume, and you can see modern things reflected in the mirror there. So that is a graphic for the show that kind of sets it up as an anachronistic look at the core issues of women in politics and other things. So, and I titled it the Woodhull Project because it's going to be ever evolving. It's not a script that's going to be set in stone, when it'll be done and done forever. This is a great photo of Victoria taken by Matthew Brady. the famous photographer during the Civil War and post. And I just find it a fascinating photo with all her things. But speaking about, she was criticized for wearing hats that looked like men's hats, and, not a very traditional or genteel dress for somebody in the public spotlight. So, but very interesting, I think. This is from the show. The Trinity is a kind of symbol that is important. She talks about in one of her lectures, that there are, we have trinities in everything. There is the religious trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the political trinity of freedom, equality, and justice, and the social trinity of cause, effect, and the process of evolution. And those three trinities make up the trinity or tri-unity of humanity. And that really kind of sets up her philosophy on just social issues and, bringing politics, spirituality, and social causes together is what's going to move society forward.
How did you authenticate the costume that you made for yourself?
I have done a lot of work at Mystic Seaport, and I had approached them and asked them if I might at the time be able to borrow a dress for my first workshop performance. And they got so excited. They were like, we have 3 purple dresses. And this one fit very well. So Victoria was known to wear purple. And always had a white rose at her throat as well. So, along with suffrage colors, she wore purple and white whenever she spoke in public or appeared in public.
Yeah, that's important. Those were the suffrage colors, purple and white. Interesting. Yeah. What's the significance of this?
This is just a medicine show wagon that I use, as a backdrop to her childhood experiences when her father brought her and her sister around places to make money off of them. And, and later what she and Colonel James Blood, they too had a wagon with fringe and traveled around giving readings and making their living that way. So just a throwback to time. And this is me in the show as their father hawking their wares with the slide in the background. I'm just reading one of her lectures on free love. And often when she spoke, she, I don't know if she had stage fright, but she would appear very fragile as she approached the stage, and would seem to go into a meditation and almost trance-like, then be full of life and energy as she spoke. There is a theory that she traveled in this period of time after she left Dr. Woodhull, that she may have gone out west and worked as an actress. So there is a theory that she also got some acting training along the way that also prepared her for a public life and giving speeches. But she would fall on her spirit guides when she was speaking as well, which, post-Civil War was not unusual for the public.
Now, did she get good attendance at her speeches, and did people find her speaking compelling? Did they?
Oh yes, she was a dynamo speaking, and that's kind of why I bring up her, her talents as a spiritualist and perhaps as an actress. That she knew how to grab a crowd's attention. The night, so when she spoke at Cooper Union in New York, and she had invited Henry Ward Beecher to kind of come and endorse her, which he didn't, which, kind of went down another road in history. It sold out, 3,000 people. There were torrential rains that night, and thousands more were turned away outside or waiting outside to try to get a glimpse and hear this speech. So her speech, the lecture circuit was really key. That's how she was able to reach people without any media, but she spoke regularly to rooms of thousands of people.
Yeah. I think we don't appreciate in today's world with TV and all the social media, we don't appreciate how back then without all those things, people left their homes and went and stood for hours to listen to the Lincoln Douglas debates and to go and see people like Victoria Woodhull and others. It was an important part of civic life back then.
And the oratory was important. You know, these speeches were well crafted. They read well today. And she was a dynamic speaker. Now, you know, she probably developed these speeches with James and, you know, other, you know, as a group. You know, I'm sure there were, it was a multi-person effort to hone them and practice them, but she was really the dynamo behind it and the speaking her thoughts.
And they didn't have amplification, did they?
No, the skill of oration was, but the halls were built in a way where, you know, they had good acoustics because that's what they needed to be, right? Right. Oh, this is just a picture of Wall Street in New York at the time. There are, you know, you can find also editorial cartoons of the evil stockbroker women. But a funny story is that Victoria and Tennessee would be working at their stock brokerage, and they couldn't go out to lunch in Wall Street without having a man with them. They couldn't, when they wanted to go out for a steak lunch. I think you know where I mean, in downtown. They were not allowed in without a man. So Tennessee wore pants, actually. She would wear a suit, and but that didn't work. And so one time they famously drove up and then had their carriage driver escort them in because so they would have a male with them and they could go have a steak for lunch.
That's great. Great story.
And this is just, this is a scene where she's talking to the Commodore as he's writing out a check for her. So to create their stock brokerage firm. Here's an actual, cover sheet for her speech about the marriage license and as a social evil. So the true and the false socially. So
it's interesting to me that so many of the women in the suffragette movement married not once or twice, but several times.
Yeah.
Many of them. They had a series of relationships.
Sheila, it says here 250,000 people had heard this speech.
Wow.
Recorded around the country. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Better than some of our politicians today, huh?
Yeah. This is her ending one of her speeches. She would at the end also kind of go into a trance and bless the audience and ask for their support in this way. So very effective, very dramatic. People maybe could debate whether or not she was channeling her spirit guide at that point. But, she was, even in the spiritualist circles, having been president of the Spiritualist Association, she was well regarded and believed in terms of that as well. This is Congress in the background, a slide of Congress where her giving her address. And you will see there's also a vase of white roses, which was an important symbol to her in front of the podium.
Well, that's amazing that someone who actually spoke in front of Congress doesn't have more information about it in our history books, because that's a huge thing, especially for a woman. Now, how many other women before Victoria Woodhull spoke in front of a joint session of Congress?
None. She was the very first woman.
There you go.
To address Congress.
Wow.
Yep. She met some senators in New York, and they talked to other people, and they got her on the floor. So, and so it was also probably, one of the first speeches making a case for women's suffrage given to Congress as well. And this is a scene where she was in jail on Election Day, and I'm reading from a newspaper. Mark Twain, who was Harry Beecher Stowe's neighbor around that time, followed, the scandal of the Henry Ward Beecher adultery trials was, as big a news story and sensationalized as anything today. It was on the front page of just about every newspaper in the country every day for months and months. And it all came about because she published in the newspaper and she was conflicted about it. But she felt there was a double standard and that his celebrity as the most famous man in America, as he was called, as a preacher, he was himself quite dynamic and well-loved, but very well known as an adulterer. The rumor was that he preached to a dozen of his mistresses every Sunday. And yet he was, lived as an upstanding citizen. Nobody ever accused him of anything. And so she sat on it for months and thought, he kind of said, I can't endorse you as a free love candidate. And she was like, look, be honest about who you are. Support my campaign. It'll be good for you. It'll be good for me. We'll talk about what does love mean, right? Love can't be regulated. And he said, you're nuts. I'm a prominent, I'm a Beecher. I'm a prominent minister. I can't do that. But she felt there was a double standard, and that double standard permeated everything. And after, months, she decided to publish a story after also firsthand experiencing the result of, actually it was Susan B. Anthony and Isabella Beecher Hooker. They were all kind of privy to this one affair that was going on that was not ending well. And she published a story in her newspaper about Henry Ward Beecher, and she used the word adultery. And the Comstock law had just kind of been sitting there waiting to find somebody to arrest. And because the newspaper was sent through the mail and it had the word adultery in it, she was arrested for sending pornography through the mail.
So what happened in that trial? What was the final result of that trial?
Oh gosh, I think, let me see. Do I have it here? I think it just went on forever. I don't know if it was. I have to get back to you on that. I should know, but it did just tear the family apart. It tore, Isabella Beecher Hooker stood by Victoria Woodhull, her siblings, Henry Ward Beecher, they all just despised her for doing that. And, but really her position was to expose, this double standard. Yeah, right. And so anyway, in the newspaper, Mark Twain is quoted as he says, the silence of the Beechers is 100 times more proof than the outspokenness of Woodhull. I don't know what the Beechers thought about his thing. And there's the Ludlow Street jail where she was on Election Day in 1872.
How long was she in jail?
I think just a couple weeks.
Weeks. Okay.
But it was horrid conditions, and women especially were all, thrown together and cold, dirty, no food. Yeah. And then we're back at the Trinity at the end.
So any final words about her? And give us any final quote, something she said that you can relate to us?
Well, here's one that's just right in front of me. Freedom without equality is fraud. And I think that's very pertinent today. People have been given freedom, but not equality.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're talking about the racial.
A lot of the work that she had started is still not done. Women do not have equal rights. We've made progress, but a lot of her speeches still ring true today.
Right. And of course, as an analogy to the racial justice movement that we're dealing with today also.
Right.
We passed laws and legislation giving freedom, giving rights, but in actuality, our promise has not been made yet, has not been fulfilled.
Right.
And finally, what's this about the car? What's that?
Oh, that's her Mercedes. Yeah. So at the end of her life, Tennessee went to the United Kingdom, and Victoria decided to follow her and just kind of break away and remove themselves from the notoriety here in the U.S. Victoria was still giving speeches and things when she went over there, and she met a prominent English banker named John Biddulph Martin, and they fell in love. He also was a soulmate to her, and so she ended her life living in a British manor. And she loved her 1903 Mercedes Simplex, and she loved driving, and would apparently speed around.
Well, she wasn't very multifaceted or different, was she? Really?
Yeah. So yeah, the way she ended her life is not what you might anticipate. But actually, they had a bond. He came to hear her speak on the issues, and he knew it. He knew all about her, and they believed in the same causes and things. So it wasn't a bad ending at all.
What year did she die in?
1927. So she lived long enough to see women get the right to vote.
Great.
Both in the UK and in the US.
All right. Let's go on to, here we go, Crusading Mrs. Cat, written and performed by Lisa Hayes. There you go, Lisa. When did you create this?
I can't see the slide.
It's a year ago this week that we had the registry.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I wrote it last year, began writing it at a playwriting retreat in Connecticut. Emma was there. And I performed it for the first time in October at the Charm City Fringe Festival. And then I performed it in February in San Diego at a leadership conference.
Right. So this is the perfect year. Is that one of the reasons that you decided to do it then?
Yeah.
Sure.
And of course, I hoped I would be touring it, but we've had this little pandemic get in the way.
Yeah. Well, you're doing it now in a sense. Oh, there you are. Now tell us about this.
Are you able to share the screen so I can see what you're showing?
Yes, we did. I did. I have it.
There it is.
Oh, there, I see it. So that's the opening of the play when the actress comes in and says, "Thank you so much for coming and giving me a chance," and all of that. So you can move on. So I become Carrie Cat, and the audience becomes a group of young suffragists that have come to meet Mrs. Cat and interview her. And they're set in Nashville at the Hermitage Hotel. That's the setting of the play. So
because that's where the final vote on the ratification is going to take place, right?
Right. I mean, hundreds of women showed up. Well, hundreds of politicians, everybody descended on this hotel. So you had the suffragists giving all the politicians yellow roses, and the anti-suffrage women giving them all red roses. They called it the War of the Roses. There were lobbyists. It was crazy. So I put this slide in to show this was kind of the whole trajectory of this movement of showing where suffrage was legal. So when Carrie Cat was a girl, there was nothing. And then in 1900, that's when she stepped into Susan Anthony's leadership role. And you had 4 states in the West. And then that was what it all looked like in 1919 as they were going out to get the amendment ratified.
Right. So states could do their own separate constitutions and give women the right to vote in the state, but then the federal government was going to create a federal right for everyone in the country to vote. Yeah.
Right. So this, I mentioned before, the emergency convention they had in Atlantic City. this was an article about that upcoming emergency meeting. But I think it's interesting how the suffrage movement was very targeted about making sure that they were as not threatening. So you put mothers on the page there. Even mothers are suffragists.
Ah.
And then the spring of 1917, America went to war. So this is, I mean, they kept farms going. They worked in munitions factories. They filled the jobs left empty by men.
So do you think that the fact that women contributed to the war effort and men in the country saw how much they contributed and how important it was to have them in the civic world, do you think that helped the amendment eventually pass?
Undoubtedly, it helped the movement. Because remember, for this all to work, the men are the ones who had to vote.
Right.
So this is the women picketing in front of the White House. Carrie Catt was appalled. She thought their tactics were divisive, and she was calling for this to end. So I think the next picture shows the pickets. Yeah. So she was opposed to that.
Yeah. She was opposed to direct action, picketing and sit-ins and things like that, whereas the other group, eventually they came together though, didn't they, in the end?
They all worked for suffrage, but they were fighting for credit right up into the end. And there was that's a part of that whole story in Nashville, because Alice Paul was trying to raise money in DC, and her field worker in Nashville was saying, you have to come, because Carrie Catt was orchestrating all of the movement in Nashville. But they both claim credit.
Okay.
So this is 1918 when suffrage first passed the House, January 1918, and it was the Congresswoman from Montana, the first Congresswoman, who began the debate.
Great.
And this is interesting. So they were trying to then get the Senate to vote yes, and there was all kinds of resistance and filibusters halting the vote. I mean, who would guess that the Senate would have a filibuster?
Right. And then the side story that we talked about a little bit is, you can see Senator Williams of Mississippi moves to bar Negro women from voting in the South.
Yes.
So that the race issue becomes important, and Carrie Chapman Catt gets accused of being more for white supremacy, when really she's just trying to get the amendment passed, and it's hard to maneuver around all of these different political movements.
And you see also there the story about influenza. So in the middle of this, not only was there war and they're trying to get the suffrage movement, the suffrage amendment passed, but everybody has the flu.
Absolutely. That's another thing that we have in common with 100 years ago, or at least in 1918, was the influenza that killed thousands in America. Millions, I think. Yes.
So it finally did pass the Senate, and then went on to be ratified by the states. So this is when Carrie Catt got the news about it passing the Senate. She was at home and informed by telephone, because she had decided after that first disastrous round, she made 30 trips to DC, and every time they'd call off the vote. So she got fed up with it all. So she refused to go down anymore. So this was her getting the news. And as soon as she got off the phone, she sent telegrams to every governor in the country urging quick ratification. And she sent wires to all of their suffrage leaders across the country saying, set our plans for ratification in motion.
Right. And how many states do they need to ratify it?
They need 36 states to ratify. So they thought that all those states in the West that had given suffrage to women before everyone else, they thought, oh, they'll ratify immediately. But a lot of them started sitting back, waiting to see what the rest of the country would do. And she got fed up and went on a tour she called the Wake Up America tour.
So you can see some of the Western states, it's interesting, like the Western states, the pioneer states, they gave suffrage rights to women first before some of the states in the East, certainly, and before the South, of course. No suffrage at all was passed by them. Interesting map.
So,
I like
this
that.
Is them trying to get the 36th Amendment. This is trying to button it up.
Right, that last one. Well, we can make an analogy to the Equal Rights Amendment, which we never ratified fully. It failed. We do not have an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution because we could not get enough states to ratify that amendment.
Right.
So, and but here we are.
They were at 35 states by March, and then it came to a grinding halt.
Right. That's a really good cartoon.
So in June, she's standing at the International Women's Suffrage Alliance meeting in Geneva, and 20 countries have given women the vote in the year since their last meeting before the First World War. And she has to stand up before the women of the world and admit that America is not one of them yet.
Wow. Yeah, we're behind in a lot of stuff like that. For example, we haven't had a woman president. Never mind the right to vote. We were behind in that. Yeah. And there are so many countries in the world that have already had women leaders.
Yeah, I include that in my show. I talk about all the countries. I list them, and I don't even read half of them. I read like 30 countries because we're not aware of that in the United States. Yeah, like the rest of the world has moved on. The United States is only one of 3 countries that don't mandate paid maternity leave.
Wow, or not to mention we don't have. Not to mention no national health insurance in America when so many other countries have that. Yeah. Well, I think Americans, we study our own American history and not that well. I don't think if you look at the man and woman on the street, they would really know a lot about American history. They might not even know who Susan B. Anthony is. And we don't learn enough about other countries. The rest of the world knows what's going on in America in some ways more than we do.
I know.
Yeah. All right, that's another show. Okay. Nation looks to salons of state for ratification. Those are the leaders. SOLONS.
Solons.
Yes.
Carrie Cat. As soon as she got home from Geneva, all she wanted to do was rest, but she was bombarded with messages about Tennessee. They said, "Dear Chief, situation hopeless under present condition. We need you." So she got on a train and went to Nashville. She arrived July 18th. So that's what this is about. And she got off the train, she waved to the reporters, and she said, "I'm confident that Tennessee will rise to the occasion and use its decisive vote for the women." Always project confidence and optimism, even when you don't do it.
Interesting that mentions the reception at Hermitage, which was Andrew Jackson. And of course, we're talking about him today. He certainly was terrible in terms of slavery and civil rights. And he was terrible in terms of Indian rights, Native American rights. And so the controversy, they're trying to tear down his statue in Washington, D.C., all part of our movement to try and, purify our country. I think it's controversial because there is history there. And we have to, as you said, Lisa, very well, you need to know the context in which these things are going on, right?
But I think, too, we've got to ask ourselves, why? Why are these the things we were taught, and why weren't we taught these other things?
Yeah.
Why are these the statues that were erected and not statues of other things? Who puts up statues of people who lost the battle? right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
Another conversation.
by the middle of August, they finally, I think it was August 18th or 9th, around then, that they finally got the legislature to come for a special session in Tennessee. So they descend on Nashville. They're all in this hotel. Within that first week, the Senate, the Tennessee Senate, approves the amendment. It's fine, but the House doesn't. And the House, the Speaker of the House, who had sworn he supported it all, he became a turncoat. He said, not only am I not going to support it, I'm going to lead the opposition. So all the battling back and forth, it went into the next week, and it was the following Wednesday when they had this vote. And the youngest member of the House, Harry Byrne, ended up changing his vote at the end because he got a letter from his mother asking him to support the women. So he was the one who changed his vote. And then the antis cooked up this whole story that he'd been bribed $10,000. They had false affidavits, and they had this whole spread in the next day's newspaper, thinking they could derail and get him to change his vote back. But the stenographer that they used for all of this was one of the suffragists. So they knew this was coming, and they were able to immediately counter it. Wow.
What a great story. And that this young man propelled himself into history with a note from his mother. That's terrific. Yeah. It's a great story. Baby member of Tennessee House admits voting yes on advice of his mother. Love it. It's terrific. And there you go.
There they won. And then Carrie Catt returned. She stopped in D.C. on her way home to thank President Wilson in person. Then she went home to New York. She had a hero's welcome, the governor and all these important politicians. There was a parade down 7th Avenue. They played Hail the Conquering Chief to her. It was something.
Wow. Terrific. And then, of course, in 1920, they voted for one of the worst presidents ever, with the women having the right to vote, Warren G. Harding, who was very corrupt and who died in office, and then Calvin Coolidge took over.
And in my show, I talk about, Carrie Catt talks about, to make it clear that they're not advocating for women not to participate in political parties. She says parties are how things get done, but don't make the mistake that just because women have the vote that they suddenly believe that women can do things as well as men. Oh, men will welcome you with a warm welcome. They'll give you eloquent evidence that all virtues and wisdom acquired to your party, but then you'll discover that there's another group within the party where you won't be so welcome, and that's where you need to be.
Right.
So she understood politics, and that's her greeting the masses.
Wow. Beautiful.
So this is what I was talking about, the article about the protests in Iowa.
And then finally, Mary Church Terrell. The political subjection of women in the United States can be likened only to a relic of barbarism.
Yeah.
So although Black...
I was just going to mention that coming up in August, we're doing a program, a Womenkind program virtually, where Nellie Bly, the famous woman reporter, is going to interview some of us as our characters.
Interesting. So it's a sad reminder of what's happening today and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that's still to be enforced 100% in this country. That although Black women gained the right to vote in 1920 with white women, the Jim Crow laws and all of the taxes and laws in the southern states made it impossible for many Black women to even have the vote. And we have voting suppression today. So we've made progress, but we have a long way to go.
So far to go.
It's been great listening to both of you tell these stories of these two remarkable women that Americans need to learn more about. So I want you each to give us a final summary, something that perhaps they each have said that's important to remember today. Emma, why don't you go ahead? Give us a final word from Victoria Woodhull.
I'm going to share
First woman to run for president of the United States. Okay.
Under a major party. I was thinking about that. So they do say she's the first woman to run for president under a major party.
Okay.
But yes. Love is a universal principle. It is the life of the universe. It is that power called attraction which holds all things together. It is the living and the motive power of the world. It is God. And that is how she sets up her philosophy on free love and how free love will rid society of many of its problems.
Great.
And women.
Lisa, help us.
Okay. Think about it. This movement began in candlelight. It passed through whale oil, kerosene, and gaslight to emerge resplendent in electric light. It began before telephones and automobiles were even dreamt of. I met a woman who walked 50 miles to a meeting and then walked back to start a suffrage club. All of the first women walked or came on horseback. The final drove their own motor cars. Millions of women lived, labored, and died that you might have the vote.
Terrific. Thank you both so much for coming on. This was great. People lived and died and fought to have the right to vote. And in America, we have yet to live up to that promise. And so many of us, sadly, don't even take the opportunity to register and to vote, become disinterested, think our government doesn't care about us. But you know what? We are the government. I keep telling people that. You are the government. Get in there, participate, speak up, learn your history. And thank you so much, Lisa and Emma, for teaching us some of that history today. Two great women. Let's celebrate the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. And let's keep working on America's problems to make it a more perfect union, a better country than we have today. It's great, but we've got to make it better. And you two are helping us. So thank you, everybody, for watching today. We'll see you next time on Talk Back. Goodbye. Bye, Emma, and goodbye, Lisa. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.